A fugitive and lurid gleam obliquely gilds the gliding stream.
All right, welcome to another exciting episode of the K Road Chronicles. K Road Chronicles, sorry.
Chronicle or Chronicles?
Chronicles is actually a different product. That's the TV show, which we're just finishing up now, the third season. We're really delighted today to have local, is that right term, local historian, or do we go further afield than local?
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I know a lot about Central Auckland, but, basically Crying Happy Road. I've been here for over 20 years now.
Yeah.
How about you introduce yourself, Edward?
No, I'm Edward Bennett. I've lived in the area for 23 years now. I was born here in Auckland last century, and Crying Happy Road has really always been a part of my life, and I've seen quite a lot of changes.
Oh, yeah, it's just in my short time, I've seen so many changes, and not all of them for the good, but, change is the only constant. What is it about Karangahape Road that floats your boat, that gets you excited, that draws you back here time and time again?
It's simply the most interesting place in the city, and indeed I would argue probably the whole country.
Valid point. And you do historic walking tours?
Yes.
And, I've eavesdropped on a couple of those. You've got a wealth of knowledge about the history of Karangahape Road. For example, as I understand it, Ngāpui, when the English colonials arrived, they were quite excited because they saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, they saw the colonials as bringing order and law and structure, but this was the boundary.
Yes.
Karangahape Road. For a long time it was called the road because people couldn't pronounce Karangahape.
Yes, but also because all the other thoroughfares that were laid out by Felton Matthew to create Auckland in the 1840s, as it happens, everything else was called street.
Right.
So it was, in fact, just about the only road.
Right.
So there would have been a number of people in the middle of the 19th century not used to Maori words, and so they saying that I'm going up to the road.
Or K Road, obviously it became that.
Yes, that would have been just quite convenient. But it until 1927, it was the only thoroughfare in the central area that had a Maori name.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, because everything else was laid out by Felton Matthew or others, and he just tended to use a whole lot of other names. And whilst Maori names obviously were used all over the isthmus and all over the province, there was actually very little from here into the CBD, as we now know it, that had a name that they used.
Because Queen Street is, sorry to interrupt, but Queen Street's actually struggled for a long time to be the central business district, isn't it? Because am I right by saying that Shortland Street was originally going to be the main shopping district?
The bottom of Queen Street was the port, and of course up on the hill where Albert Park is was the Albert Barracks, and that's where the governor's house was built, and a whole lot of other people lived close to the governor, and the High Court was built there, and a couple of churches and various things.
And this is the existing High Court on, is it
Waterloo Quadrant?
Waterloo Quadrant.
Yeah. So that area was the upper bit of the city that you could look out onto the harbour, and then to get from the port, which is basically the bottom of Queen Street where it meets Fort Street and Shortland Street, Shortland Street became the major route between those two things. You have the centre of commerce being the corner of Shortland Street and Queen Street, and the centre of power being the intersection of Shortland and Princes Street.
And it also became a TV show.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why they put the Shortland, the broadcasting station there in 1935, because they were able to build that brick building on Shortland Street just there, overlooking the harbour, because it actually has a very...
I know I've always wondered what that building was about.
So the show is called Shortland Street, not because there's a hospital there, but because that was where they're filming it.
Everyone in television in Auckland had always, I'm going into work at Shortland Street. Shortland Street.
It's like an in-joke.
Whereas in Wellington, you said, I did some work at Avalon. Avalon was the big studio.
Isn't that another TV show, Avalon? No, it's a song by Roxy Music. Yeah.
Yes, so it just became shorthand. Anything to do with Television New Zealand was Shortland Street. And then they moved from there to the big television production building up on Victoria Street. And somebody, when they were creating that soap opera, ironically used the name Shortland Street, because it was an in-joke inside television.
What if you had to make a soap opera for K Road? What's your pitch?
Good question.
You mean a contemporary one?
Yeah, let's say there's some funding here, if you can convince us.
Oh, I don't know, a food court?
That'd be interesting.
Or the food court.
I mean, one of the things about the concept of a soap opera is that you want a core group of characters and their family at home, but you also want the ability to introduce as many diverse characters as possible. That's one of the reasons why the hospital is such a good idea for a soap opera.
It's a mainstay of soap operas.
Yes, because you can
Constantly bring a new cast.
New cast, and of course there's always somebody worrying about dying or not dying. You will, if nothing else fails, you can always say, somebody can get upset that they've been diagnosed with cancer.
Food court's slightly less dramatic, but it is on K Road, so
well, indeed, and
the drama will bleed into it.
That's right. I mean, one of the other big soap operas for a long time was called Crossroads, which was basically about a trucking company, and across the road there was a cafe and a pub and a motel.
A New Zealand show?
No, that was British. That was the other main. But it's this idea that you have these 4 businesses on Crossroads, and it's like you can introduce as many diverse characters as you want. It's an interesting thing. Something like a food court, certainly.
Cool. And did you write a book on K Road, or did ChatGPT lie to me?
I am trying to write a book, a history on Kringhappy Road, but there's just so much information, so I've been struggling with it for the better part of a decade now. I did write a book on the history of Myers Park.
And that's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but before it was bought by Sir Doug Myers, wasn't it a bit of a shanty town?
That particular area between the town hall and Kringhappy Road proper, there was a lot of crowded, substandard, working class housing in that area, all down Vincent Street, Grays Avenue, Queen Street, Liverpool Street, Airedale Street. It was one of the reasons why they decided to build the town hall where it is in 1911 was precisely to try and do something with the area. And so the area just above the town hall had a lot of very shoddy houses, bit of prostitution, the Chinatown, and along with the idea of creating the town hall, there was this idea that there's this gully.
Because there was an open creek.
That's right. There's this gully with a creek just behind the town hall, and there's not very many houses in it. Like it's almost a blank area, but it's surrounded by very substandard housing, with some dodgy stuff going on. But it will be built on very, very quickly. So that's why Arthur Myers, who was Mayor of Auckland, was talked into giving a whole lot of money, £10,000, which was a very large amount of money at the time, to purchase the land, because they knew that they had to act then. So
what's your book called then?
A Centennial History of Myers Park. Yes. Arthur Myers, his son was Kenneth Myers, and his son was Douglas Myers.
Ah, right. Because everyone thinks Myers, Sir Doug Myers.
That's right. Well, that's the grandson. Yes.
I didn't realise that.
Yes.
There you go. So they were the whole family was involved in politics.
In one way or another. Arthur Myers was a brewer, a beer company. That's why Douglas Myers made all his money in Lion Nathan beer.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because Kenneth had taken over the business from Arthur, and then it was handed on, but the directorship to Douglas.
Oh, interesting. I've done a little bit of reading on books that I've found on Karangahape Road, and it's interesting that there are, what's the word I'm looking for, inaccuracies in a lot of these books. Like I read a story about St. Kevin's Arcade, which, by the way, is spelt wrong. Yeah, on the top of the thing, it
Really?
should have a possessive apostrophe.
Right.
Unless there's
You could climb up there and add it.
Could do. But there's a lot of misinformation about Karangahape Road out there as well. So
Well, any place which is interesting is going to be talked about, and a place where people get drunk, let's make no bones about it, and where there has been a certain amount of say, prostitution and the occasional bit of crime, there will be probably a higher percentage of colourful stories related whilst people are drinking in pubs over years, and they are half remembering what they had been told 10 or 15 years before by somebody who was equally drunk.
Have you got a good one for us?
Oh, well, there's the story about the horse.
yeah, that's a good one about the policeman dragging around the car.
Yes,
Is that true or not?
Well, the thing about that is that the closer you get to these stories, the more out of focus they get. Because the story is that you have an Englishman, a policeman, who arrived in Auckland, obviously in the 19th century, and he's sent out on the beat and he finds a dead horse. Now, dead horses were actually just one of the things that it was a fairly common occurrence.
Okay.
If you're out delivering something and your horse drops dead, like a horse is a very big thing, you can't get rid of it.
Yeah.
You just walk off and leave it if you can. So
No point flogging it.
No, indeed. Municipal authorities were constantly, every morning there would probably be a dead horse somewhere that the city council would have to go and deal with. And so a policeman, that was one of the things, coming back from doing his beat, it's like, oh, I found, incidentally, there's a dead horse, we better tell the council, so that they can go and collect it. So apparently he found this horse, and after several unsuccessful attempts at trying to spell Karangahape, he dragged it a few feet around the corner into Pitt Street.
Yeah,
Because
see,
you could-
my problem with that is I doubt that one man, regardless of how big he is going to be able to drag a horse.
There is that. Mind you, a large man, a particularly small horse, you never know. The problem with that particular story is that it turns up everywhere.
Okay.
All through Britain, all through North America, Canada. It turns
It's
up.
urban legend.
It turns up in the Philippines. It turns up in Prague,
Right.
where an Austrian policeman can't spell the Hungarian name, and so he drags it into the next street, which has a German
Easier to
name.
spell.
That's right.
why he dragged it.
Yes,
Yeah.
a shorter German name, and like when you actually look at that, it's like there are sort of like 300 versions of that story all over the world.
So what are your thoughts on the gentrification? I mean, we've seen a massive upheaval in the last couple of years with the redesign and new footpaths and new businesses going in. A lot of people are not really happy about the gentrification. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, speaking as somebody who's been here for over half a century, this is not new. If you look back through newspaper reports, right back in the 1970s, people were worried about gentrification on K Road.
Right.
all through the 80s with the rebuilding.
Yeah.
We were very worried. And then with the 90s, again, the influx of nightclubs, for example. You see, up until the early 90s, there were very, very few nightclubs or bars on Karangahape Road.
Oh, is that right?
And
I thought it was traditionally an entertainment area.
No, that was down near the waterfront.
Right. Well, that makes sense.
What was K Road back then?
Karangahape Road was a quite respectable, almost boring shopping street. That's why we have a department, George Court's department store. And
that must have been amazing.
And here, like, we're inside the Rendell's department store, and opposite is St Kevin's Arcade. You see, it's actually very middle of the road, quite literally. And apart from a couple of pubs, and a few, there was obviously a range of businesses, right from Pascoe's Jewellers and the George Court's department store right through to the Naval and Family Hotel, and a whole lot of, things, and a few dance halls. But up until the 1960s, if you were wanting to go out to kick up your heels, you would have gone to the lower part of Queen Street. Not here on Karangahape Road at all. It just wasn't the thing. Apart from the stuff going on in a few of the pubs, it was just very middle of the road shops selling clothing, shoes, furniture, food, and of course several department stores. Then things changed in the 1960s, partially because of the motorways coming through. And in particular, a whole lot of buildings got demolished along the Auckland waterfront. Oh. And that meant that a whole lot of the tattoo parlours and billiard parlours and massage parlours and brothels needed to find somewhere to go.
So it's a de-gentrification of K Road.
Yes, exactly. And this is what happened, that in the 40s and 50s, Karangahape Road was largely a place where ladies wore gloves when they came to shop during the middle of the day. And then, in the early 60s, right through the 70s, there started being an influx of these colourful things, like the Pink Pussycat Club, like David Flame's Naughty Underwear Emporium, and
what a great name.
And obviously a few massage parlours and brothels. So it was interesting. All through the 60s, 70s and into the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, we had one part of the street that still had department stores and Pascoe's and Stevens for Gifts, and one part of the road that had the Pink Pussycat Club and David Flame and a number of ladies standing around on street corners at night. So there was actually this complete contrast.
Yeah.
Then
living in harmony.
Well, part of the thing was is that one of the interesting things is that it's almost like an ecosystem where you have the daylight animals that come out, and then when they go to sleep, you have the nighttime economy. And so, by and large, they coexist because they almost completely ignore each other. And that still goes on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. It's still pretty much like that.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I find interesting about Karangahape Road, is that there's about 3 or 4 Karangahape Roads, depending on, because somebody might only come here at night, and they have no idea that there are accountants and dentists.
Yeah.
There are other people who shop here during the day or work in the accountants and the dentist, and they never come here at night.
Yeah.
Now, during the 1980s, there was a huge amount of rebuilding in the centre of town, in the Queen Street Valley. I mean, it's one of the interesting things that Karangahape Road, 83% of the buildings on Karangahape Road date from before the Second World War.
Well,
it's actually really high.
Yeah.
So prior to 1938.
Yeah. Whereas in the Queen Street Valley, it's only 18%.
Oh.
Newmarket's around about 8%. It's actually really, really low. So what happened all through the 1980s, a whole lot of people were so-called developers were buying up old buildings, often a collection of quite small buildings, and combining them into a larger title, demolishing them and building a mirror glass office tower. What that meant was that all the businesses that had been in those buildings needed to find somewhere to relocate, including all the nightclubs that had been taking up various odd little basements. So at the beginning of the 90s, we had an influx of about 20 or 30 nightclubs and bars and restaurants from it was interesting, when I came out in society in the early 80s, the nightclubs were down in the Queen Street Valley and High Street.
I remember High Street being a real clubbing part of town.
And then all of a sudden there were virtually no nightclubs in the Queen Street Valley at all. And they were all up on Cranhappy Road. And at the time, that was seen as a thing of gentrification, because all of a sudden there were all these young yuppies, as they were termed at the time, splashing money about in new nightclubs, and shops that had previously been run by Polynesians, for example, selling fruit and vegetables or Polynesian clothing, all of a sudden they had become a smart bar or a restaurant or a nightclub. And so people were actually... This is the early 90s, and people saying, "Oh, I'm worried about gentrification because the Indian Emporium is closing down and it's going to be replaced by a new wine bar." And that has continued ever since. Now, at the moment, what we have is the people who, like myself, who very happily all through the 90s and the early 2000s were going to those nightclubs and bars and wine bars. And those wine bars are being replaced by frock shops and other things. And so people are worried about gentrification, but this is actually the first wave of gentrification, worried about the second wave.
Yeah.
If you can see it in that way.
It's really interesting to hear your perspective on that. If you could, take a magic wand, if you were Mayor of Karangahape Road, what would you like to see changed?
Oh, I don't know. Part of the problem with this is that I liken Karangahape Road to a giant coral reef. That you have lots of interesting, colourful animals that float in and out at various times, according to the day or night. You have things like me, who's like a little limpet or a barnacle, hiding in a rock pool.
You were hard to find, actually. So. Shout out to Panda, who put me in touch with you.
But there are all these interesting things that come and go.
Yeah.
I'm nostalgic for the period when there were, say, 40 or 50 Polynesian shops on Karangahape Road.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you see, is that those shops were here, like the Polynesian travel agents and Polynesian accountants, and selling food and clothing, because those people lived directly next to Karangahape Road in Freeman's Bay and Ponsonby and Grey Lynn and Sandringham, which is where I flattered as a student in the 80s and the 90s. Now, those people discovered that the house that they'd bought, they could sell and buy 3 or 4 houses in South Auckland.
Right.
And others, like me, had discovered that they could no longer afford to rent in Grey Lynn.
Yeah.
So that has meant that there's been a wholesale exodus of people like me from Grey Lynn, and also a lot of Polynesians. So that's why there are no longer the number of Polynesian shops on Karangahape Road. But then again, you see, I never spent any money in them. It's one of the things of, well, I would like them to be there because they were colourful and interesting and picturesque. But when they were there, I didn't do anything to keep them.
Right. You're at the wine bar.
Yes, I'm nostalgic for that period when you could walk along the road and you would see a lady in gloves and hat and handbag, and a Polynesian woman buying taro, and a punk rocker and a drag queen. That's my idea of Karangahape Road. But if the the greater number of the Pacific Island families have relocated away from Karangahape Road, you can't artificially have those businesses anymore. It's just not going to happen. This is part of the problem about people wanting an interesting street life and interesting areas of a city. It's not. You can't just make it happen. You can't tell everyone, well, you are interesting, you are going to live in this area. Because basically that's ghettoisation.
Yeah.
It has to happen naturally. Karangahape Road, we're very, very lucky because it happens to be the main route for a lot of people in and out. I mean, up until 1959, when the Harbour Bridge was built, if you wanted to get out of Auckland to go to the rest of the country, you came up Simon Street to get to Mount Eden Road or Dominion Road or Manukau Road to go south or east. And if you wanted to go north or west, you came up Hobson Street to Pitt Street to get to the Great North Road, to go out via Point Chevalier, Avondale and Henderson to go around the top of the harbour. So Karangahape Road just happens to be, it's very, very strange. I'm not sure that there can be very many places like it where this particular area happens to be the main route north, south, east and west out of Auckland. And that's why Karangahape Road has maintained the energy and the diversity.
There's definitely something special about this region.
Yes. And you can see that in a number of other places around the world. You know, like people tell me about Oxford Street in Sydney and the Castro in San Francisco, or various parts of London, and of course the Left Bank in Paris. There's always an area. Well, somebody I knew years ago remarked that you know, every city is like a slightly uneven billiard table, and there's always one hole towards which all the odd balls will roll.
I like that.
Yes, it's a very nice metaphor. And Karangahape Road is that pocket where all the odd, colourful balls will come to rest sooner or later. And that's why I like it. And that may not be changed a huge amount by gentrification.
Well, I equate it to you can change the buildings, you can change the road layout, but it's people that make a community. Yes. And we've got some really wonderful people that are passionate about Karangahape Road, passionate about the arts. You know, and speaking of that, just a prime time to thank my sponsors. Art shows, the K Road Business Association, the White Ladies Saloon Bar. Please support our sponsors, and if you like what we're doing, check out the Patreon page, K Road Chronicle. There's limited content there. There's more content going up every week, and you know, it's just keeps us going, allows us to interview interesting people like Edward and, you know, all the other cast of characters we've had on the show. We love the feedback we're receiving. It's been great. So sorry about our commercial break. Back to Edward. What do you see the future of K Road being like in the next, not 5 years, but 100 years from now?
Look, if you could be certain about things like that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I'd be busy making plans.
What are you doing with yourself these days?
Well, I'm writing my books. I mean, the book on the history of Karangahape Road. I mean, I am struggling with it because there's just so much information, and it's like no matter what you put in, somebody's going to complain that you've left out an important bit.
Where's the horse story?
Well, yes, that's right. I mean, I've actually worked out that I'm having an appendix at the end of the book, and one of the pages there's a thing about stories about Karangahape Road, and just listing them, saying these are the stories that you will have heard, but they're probably not true, and I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Yep.
And the horse story is one of them.
Yeah, don't remove the appendix. I did that once. It was very painful.
Yep.
There are whores, but no horses.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, look, Edward, I know you're a very busy man, and I want to just take the opportunity to thank you for taking your time out of your schedule to come and enlighten us about the history of Karangahape Road. Do you have any final comments, final words of wisdom you'd like to share?
No, I think, I mean, by and large, when you consider what Karangahape Road is, I think we get along very, very well.
Yeah.
For such a diverse community.
We've got a real sense of community here, eh? You know?
But when you think about there's a lot of intersection between all different parts of New Zealand society, and it just happens to be one of those places where a lot of people can end up having coffee next to each other.
Yeah, and it's been like, I remember the days before texting, you know, you'd sit at Verona or one of the other cafes and you'd start chatting to people and you'd, you know, share stories, and it was just a real kind of sense of togetherness, a sense of community.
It's what used to be termed, you know, the cliche of a melting pot.
Yeah, totally.
Place to be.
Dan?
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been great hearing your stories. And,
thank you.
Look forward to reading the book when it comes out.
Jolly good.
And if we can help publish that in any way, I'm sure we'd be keen to get on board that too. Hey, look, Edward does walking tours. How do we get on a walking tour?
Oh, well, every year in October, the Auckland Council has the Heritage Festival.
Yep.
So I do walking tours as part of that. They're free. And
I can
and
afford
then
that.
I can continue them through summer. And I do I help with a Facebook page, K Road Heritage. I have a couple of people helping me, and so I can be contacted through that.
Great.
Look, we'll put that in the calendar, and we'll make sure we remind people when that's coming up.
Sure.
And just wish you all the best love and happiness for the future. And yeah, just once again, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.